Today is going to be the last class, so it's kind of a melancholy type of feeling that I have about this class. But I mean, everything has to come to an end, right? So this is one of those situations where eventually we've come to the last class that we have. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we have done and then where we're going next, and talk about the exam that I plan to give you all. And please don't feel pressured to, like, this is not, don't get the anxiety that Sarah has right now because she's going through graduate school studying library science. So you don't have to feel pressured or anything to do really good on this exam, but I think it's a good thing for us to know and for you to know as well. So I would encourage you to use the exam that we're going to give you, and we're going to think of a format, and it's going to be really easy to do. And I think it's largely you could do it anonymously, so you don't have to feel embarrassed if you're not going to score high. But it's a good thing to know that, for example, you need to study more ancient history or more medieval history or more modern Assyrian history and find out. So we're going to organize the test, Sarah and Brian, Benjamin, and I, through the Assyrian Cultural Foundation, and we will send it to everyone who has signed up for the class. And I think, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we have something like 500, over 500 names. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, we have 600 now.
Wow. Okay. So there are 600 people who signed up for this class. How many do we have today, by the way? Oh, a small percentage. We only have. Okay, that's okay. No problem. I think that if everyone takes the exam, if at least 500 people take the exam, it's really a good measure of how much Assyrians know about their history. Assuming, of course, the premise is that this was, taken by everyone without the use of Google and GPI. And anyway, you can't Google a lot of the stuff that's on there. So I think it's a and I have to go back over the exam to make sure that you just don't Google the answers. Okay. So we're going to have an exam at the end of this class, and I think it's a good way for you to test your knowledge of Assyrian history, and also for us to know, how much do Assyrians really know about their history? What do they understand? How specific is that knowledge? Are they as good as, for example, other people who know their history and revere their history in the world? Is there an indication that knowing your history, feeling close to it, and so on, allows you to assimilate much less than others who, for example, um, are less likely to know their history, such as Assyrians, for example, or is this just an academic exercise? Something for us to think about. So I have this image in the slide here. Sorry, I'm distracted by reading something. Today's lecture is going to be on the setting today. What do we mean by the setting today? We mean the Assyrian setting today, all over the world, the Assyrian situation as it stands from a political perspective, from an economic perspective, if one can categorize it this way, from a social and religious perspective, demographic, geographic perspective. So we're going to take a look at also the state of Assyrian history as it is known by Assyrians and by others. So I put this image for you today because I think it reflects, for me, this is, by the way, from the British Museum. And although the article was written about Ashurbanipal, King Ashurbanipal, because there was a museum display about King Ashurbanipal in England a few years ago, a couple of years ago. This particular image is from the palace of Sargon II. And you see what we speculate is an Assyrian kind of staring longingly and perhaps with much sorrow or admiration. We're not sure. It's kind of like the Mona Lisa, the Assyrian Mona Lisa staring at an ancient ancestor. And this is from the British Museum. So this is kind of encapsulating for us a view of Assyrians today when they think about their history. Typically, they think about the greatness of ancient history and lament the present situation of their people in all aspects. I have a friend who tells me that he has much admiration for ancient Assyrian history, and he really prefers to, when speaking of Assyrian history, recall ancient Assyrian history, or collectively, as it were, recall ancient Assyrian history rather than modern, because the ancient Assyrians accomplished so much, and their modern descendants have really not lived up to the accomplishments and the greatness and the character of ancient Assyria. So one of the things we have to remember today when we talk about the setting, the Assyrian setting, is that what is left of the Assyrian people that were really created in the land of Assyria, is something like 5%. So about 5% of the Assyrians are today left in Iraq, in the homeland. I would include those in Turkey and Syria and Iran as being part of that 5%, roughly the 5%. The majority of our people are either living in the various countries of the world, such as Europe, Russia, the United States, Canada, even South America, or are on their way from Middle Eastern countries. They're transitioning to go to the West. So Assyrians today, this is a reality, are no longer a majority of the Assyrian population in their homeland. And when we talk about the Assyrians, I include people who define themselves today as Chaldeans or Syriacs or Aramaeans as well. All of these people speak the same language, come from the same geography, are part of the same demographic and cultural setting and location, and share religious traditions that are similar. And I'm not talking about Christology here or theological differences. I'm talking about cultural traditions of Eastern churches. Now, among those people are, of course, Western type Protestants, but those we count as recent departures from the Assyrian churches. And we're talking about, for example, the ancient church of the East, the Assyrian church of the East, the Chaldean church, the Syriac Orthodox church, and so on. Now, when we look at Assyrian history, if you send your child or yourself, if you go yourself and study Assyrian history, you know that Assyrian history should be viewed as a whole. So you look at the ancient period, you look at the arrival of Christianity, you look at the modern period, and you think it's going to be treated as a whole in the various academic institutions that study our history, Assyrian history. But that is not the case. And it is segmented in such a way as to create a type of conceptual disruption from the ancient past to the modern. So Assyriologists, for example, will study ancient Assyrians from a very narrow perspective, for example, in most cases, and really have nothing to say about the time that Assyrians become Christians, and certainly nothing to say about the link between ancient and modern Assyrians. By and large, this is in the majority of cases. There are exceptions. If you were attending, for example, a lecture by Professor Zach Cherry or Professor Shana Zaya, both of whom are Assyriologists, or you happen to catch a lecture by Professor Simo Parpola, Professor Emeritus Simo Parpola, who is a retired Assyriologist, one of the greatest Assyriologists in the world, you would see something different. But by and large, Assyriologists say, when it comes to your Assyrian Christian history, leave that. I'm really specializing in this area. And then when we come to specialists in Syriac history, they say, well, leave that ancient history aside. We're not really so much interested in that. We're not focused on that. That's really something separate. We call that ancient Assyrian. We call this Syriac, and we call you Nestorians or Syriacs or Chaldeans, and so on and so forth. Now, there's been some changes to this way of thinking, this conceptualization. But by and large, this is what Assyrians have to contend with still, I would say. In addition to that, there is much derogatory information about ancient Assyrian history. And one would think that this was in the past, but the truth is that even recent books, such as, for example, the Complete Idiot's Guide to World History. Now, you might be thinking, well, the title says it all. No, it's not the only one that talks in this way, but refers to an entire people, an entire civilization as the hated Assyrians. Now, why would someone say the hated Assyrians? How many people do you know in history are categorized in this way? The hated, such and such a people. So this is something that seems to be unusual to Assyrians, although there are examples, I would say, in certain segments of history and by certain segments of the population that portray a particular people this way, but certainly this should not be tolerated in respected academic circles. And this is Timothy Hall, who is not just a writer, but also a teacher. And another writer in 2016 categorizes the Assyrians as not less than barbarians. Assyrian national history, as preserved for us in its cuneiform inscriptions and images on walls and floors of palaces and temples, etc., consists mainly of military campaigns and battles. It is perhaps the most gory and bloodthirsty of history known. Now, Gary Webster, who wrote on terrorists of the ancient world, does not seem to understand history because he does not know history, but he feels free. He does not have a comprehensive understanding of history, but he feels free to categorize Assyrian history as the bloodthirsty history that has ever been known. And Simon Anglum from King's College, who again should know better, is an academic, recently said, while historians tend to shy away from analogies, it is tempting to see the Assyrian Empire as a historical forebearer of Nazi Germany, an aggressive, murderously vindictive regime supported by a magnificent and successful war machine. So again, a miscategorizing and a misunderstanding of history, but this is out there and it's not going away very soon. And Thomas Bolin, a professor at Nordberg College in 2017, tells us it would not be an overstatement to characterize Assyria's relentless cruelty as religious terrorism akin to that being played out in Syria, Iraq, and other countries by ISIS today. And of course, this was written in 2017 when ISIS damaged so much Assyrian history and Assyrian artifacts and ancient Assyrian cities, while the world watched, many in anguish among the scientific community, within the scientific community, but political leaders who did nothing to stop the destruction of these artifacts. Now, what's true about the Assyrians is, of course, that they were warriors. They ran an empire which was very efficient and very powerful. And so it doesn't take really much to think that an empire in history, in any empire in history, needs a military force to succeed. There is no empire in the history of the world that has succeeded without a military force. So to believe that the Assyrians were unique in their brutal war machine of a civilization, to believe that this is kind of unique in history is a rather silly, notion. And Andre Perot, who is a great scholar who was the author of The Arts of Assyria, says, because he understands Mesopotamian and Assyrian history, that there is no other ancient civilization that has bequeathed to the world so vast corpus of documents as ancient Assyria. And that is certainly true statistically, not just because we are saying it in an Assyrian history class, but that is absolutely true. And so true is the fact that Assyrians valued writing and valued creating archives and libraries and literature, that they were obsessed with their voices being heard. And this is not just kings, but Ashur-nasir-pal II tells us, as for the one who prevents scholars from seeing and reading the contents of my inscriptions, restricts anyone access to my inscription in order that it might not be seen and read, may Ashur curse his destiny. Cursing one's destiny is one of the greatest curses that one can inflict on a person who tries to prevent the reading of your writing. No doubt, Ashur-nasir-pal II, the creator of Nimrud, which was destroyed by ISIS, is now cursing, having Ashur curse the destiny of members of ISIS. Well, what's also true about the Assyrians is, as Assyriologist Karen Radner tells us, is that Assyrian officials were eager to interact positively with the populations of the empire and to maintain shulumu, or shlama, or peace. That is very true about the Assyrian Empire. In fact, there are many quotations from various Assyrian kings where the obsession is with diplomatic overtures. So, for example, King Sargon II tells his officials, make sure that you see if you can bring him along, this foreign leader, bring him along peacefully, or thank you for doing this peacefully and diplomatically so we do not have to wage war. So if it came to waging war versus waging peace, the Assyrians certainly preferred to wage peace, and that would mean a more productive and a more powerful empire. So all of what you've heard about Assyrians being compared to Nazis certainly does not square with ancient Assyrian history. It just does not square with the written record. The record reflects something much more diplomatic and certainly more amenable to one categorizing the Assyrian Empire along with other empires in history, which I guess one could call them normal empires, whether it's the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire. And by the way, in this regard, oftentimes the Persian Empire is compared to the Assyrians as being less ruthless. There's absolutely no such, there should be no such view. The Assyrians, like the Persians, like the Greeks after them, engaged in destruction, but also engaged in peace, and they were no different. In fact, there are various papers showing that the policies of Persian kings, which are often thought to be espousing peace and forgiveness and so on, are direct descendants and identical to the policies practiced by Neo-Assyrian kings in specific. In the ancient Assyrian days, it's important to know that investments in cities and projects, large-scale projects, took place. And one of them was the Hanging Gardens of Nineveh, oftentimes thought to be the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Most scholars today agree that the Hanging Gardens, in fact, were never in Babylon. They were in the city of Nineveh. And they would not come about had the Assyrian kings and the crown and the palace not spent a great deal of money orchestrating a major investments for the creation of powerful cities such as Nineveh and other Assyrian cities, and even across the empire. This brought profit into the empire, and it was good for the palace, and it was good for the Assyrian nation, the state, and the empire. Education also proceeded under the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal. Assyria was at the center of the world, militarily, politically, economically, and culturally. Ashurbanipal could, with much justification, refer to himself as the king of Assyria, the king of the universe. He ordered scholars to search for tablets, and there are many such letters urging various scholars to bring various literature that was written before. And you have people, for example, in cities such as Ur or Uruk, saying, unlike the people, the scholars that were working with you in Babylon, we are much better. We will not sleep until we get you these tablets. We will make sure that you have the literature that you want, dear king. And from all over the empire, various tablets were collected. And by no means is Ashurbanipal unique. He was certainly much more feverish in his attempts to gather literature, but other Assyrian kings also had archives. And there are archival centers or libraries found throughout the Assyrian heartland, including in the city of Ashur. And there are hundreds of such libraries that possibly remain undiscovered until now. Now, along with Assyrian history, of course, proceeding to more modern times, the Assyrians are facing a challenge, and that is how to deal with their history in their homeland, which is unfortunately not possible. So we have Assyrian genocide memorials all over the world, but not in the homeland. Not a single one, unfortunately, stands in the Middle East. Now, there are some examples in Iraq. There is certainly an attempt to create a monument in the Semele area. That would be one of the very first. There are smaller monuments in the Middle East on private property, but certainly nothing commemorating the devastation that Assyrians experienced during the First World War. So this is now, just like the Assyrians, a historical marker that is created really in the diaspora, in the outside. And here you see images from Australia, Greece, Chicago, the Netherlands, and Armenia. In the homeland, the Assyrian Democratic Movement, remember we talked about political parties, and one of the most prominent was the Assyrian Democratic Movement. The Assyrian Democratic Movement has lost its seats. The Assyrian Democratic Movement was the most prominent party among all of the Christians in Iraq, all Assyrian Christians, even if they do not so proclaim themselves, was the most prominent movement. It held the majority seats in the Iraqi parliament, and the Kurdistan regional government's power structure, and this has been lost recently. So the Assyrian Democratic Movement no longer holds any seats in the Iraqi parliament. All those seats have been taken up by something called the Babylonian movement, Babiliyun in Arabic. And that is a movement that is run by a gentleman by the name of Riyan al-Kaldani, Sheikh Riyan al-Kaldani, he calls himself, who is a member of the PMF, or paramilitary forces that are supported by Iran. And Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriacs, as they're sometimes known, are referred to simply as Christians. And the translation has often been the Christian component in Iraq. Now, the number of Christians estimated, Assyrians estimated to be 1.5 million. Some argue with this number. They say it's closer to 1 million. It was 1 million prior to, especially prior to the Gulf War, the last Gulf War in 2003. It was something like 1 million, 1.2 perhaps, something like that. Now it's gone down to less than 200,000 in Iraq. And the state right now is that the Chaldean Church, which was up until now the largest church in Iraq, headed by His Beatitude Marsako, is in conflict with this party of Rayan al-Kaldani, the Babylonian movement, affiliated with the PMF. And there has been recently a major scandal, accusations going back and forth, the accusation that the patriarch has sold properties belonging to the Chaldean church for profit, and counter allegations and counter accusations by the church against Rayan al-Kaldani that he does not represent this Christian body, that his rule is an illegitimate reign, and that we cannot tolerate this man, this coming from the Chaldean church. There's more to come on this, and history is being written right now, very tragic history of the Assyrian people in Iraq, as emigration takes its toll, in addition to displacement and alienation. So relations between the Assyrian Church of the East and the Chaldean Church oftentimes vary depending on the events that are not are not guided by policy. So there's no policy of, for example, the Chaldean Church or the Assyrian Church of the East, one against the other. So oftentimes events take precedent, and a nasty letter by one or a nasty comment by one triggers behavior by the other side, and so on and so forth. This is very unfortunate, though I think there are attempts to diplomatically deal with each other and at least try to present a united front in Iraq. So the state of the Assyrian nation today, what are the components of it? They are churches, and by components meaning people that gravitate the masses, or that act to maintain the nation as it is, maintain the people, or the Assyrian culture and identity. It's churches, it's social organizations, it's political parties, it's tribes and village affiliations, which are no longer having the pull that they once had. I would say the same with political parties. It's families. The family is a very important component of the Assyrian nation right now, and I will say something about the family, as well as the individuals. Individual Assyrians do make a difference in impacting the existence of Assyrians. And here I just give you a couple of examples. Sometimes I get emails saying, why didn't you mention this person? Well, I'm just going to mention a couple of people from different areas. One is from the athletic perspective, and that is Benil Daryush, who's one of the best known fighters, who's rising through the ranks, or has been rising through the ranks for some years, and always presents himself as an Assyrian, and presents his flag, the flag of his people, and is quick to advertise his Assyrianism as well as his Christianity. Another great individual is the late Hannibal Alkhas, who's no longer with us, but who has created like, for example, William Daniel and other great Assyrians, created a great amount of literature as well as art, and particularly paintings, and is widely respected, in particular in Iran, but also throughout the world, by those who are familiar with art. So individuals, families, groups of Assyrians, political parties, social organizations, and churches play a very important role in maintaining the Assyrian existence. As far as the Assyrian Church of the East, which is most, I would say, familiar to many of you here in this lecture, and many of you watching by YouTube, headed by Patriarch Marawa at this time, Marawa III, who is American-born, now officially residing in the city of Erbil. Unfortunately for the Church of the East, its members number less than 10,000 currently. The church reunification attempts with the ancient Church of the East have failed. The numbers, I believe, are equal, though it's difficult to tell each belonging to which particular church. But the entire Church of the East, of course, I would always include the Chaldean Church as well, but the Chaldean Church is in communion with Rome, unlike the two other churches of the East, the Assyrian Church of the East and the ancient Church of the East. One characteristic is currently that it lacks strong membership, as assimilation is rapidly proceeding throughout the diaspora. And if you're unsure of this, I would suggest you go to churches and you do you look through the number of people attending church and see how many are older and from the Middle East, and how many are from the United States, being born in the United States or being born in Europe or Australia. I would say Australia is the only one which has area of the Assyrian Church of the East, which has achieved a semblance of maintaining its existence, and that has been through the efforts of His Beatitude Marmilis Zaya in Australia, who has created schools. With all the criticism that sometimes is leveled against Marmilis Zaya, I think he's deserving of at least being recognized as having created something that has not been created elsewhere. The ancient Church of the East has membership in Chicago and throughout the United States. Iraq has less than 10,000, like the Assyrian Church of the East. The patriarch to become is Margi Vargasyonen, American-born, who's in Chicago, was a bishop, who's seen here in this photograph. Attempts at reunification with the Assyrian Church of the East failed. They were undertaken in Chicago, and these attempts failed, unfortunately. But I think there are other attempts at unifying or reunifying the church that has had split something like 50 years ago. The Chaldean Catholic Church was traditionally the largest community of Christians in Iraq. It is now approximately 50,000 in Iraq. Most are in the United States, Michigan, and California, approximately, according to the Chaldean Foundation, which did its own census, approximately 160,000 in the Michigan area and about 30,000 in the San Diego, California area, and lesser numbers throughout the United States. The church has a leading role in matters, especially in the diaspora, along with social and business organizations, though I should tell you that all churches in the West experience a loss of jurisdiction and loss of power and loss of influence in Western countries as a general matter. And there is much more kind of resistance to church orders and church proclamations. And this has been going on for some years now, certainly very unique, nothing like what had happened in the Middle East. although even that is changing, as I recounted to you the accusations leveled against the patriarch in Iraq by Rayan al-Kaldani. That certainly is a departure from the past. The Syriac Orthodox Church is headed by Marafrim in Syria. Membership in Iraq and Syria is estimated possibly at 50,000, though again, numbers are unreliable because in part people leave and sometimes they come back. By and large, people in Iraq are leaving. They're not going to come back. The Syriac Orthodox Church doctrinally is in communion with the Coptic Orthodox and Armenian Orthodox Church, and not with either the Chaldean or the Church of the East. It is currently dispersed throughout Europe, Sweden, and Germany in particular. Mara Fram, the head of the church, is in Syria and has taken a very clear position that is supportive of the Syrian government and the Syrian president, and has been able to build various structures in Syria to maintain or attempt to maintain the existence of the church in Syria. Marafram, of course, was a bishop in the Syriac Orthodox Church here in the United States, was the bishop on the East Coast, and he would visit Chicago periodically. He is now living in Syria, and you see him here in the photograph. The Syriac Catholic Church, which parted from the Syriac Orthodox Church in the 1700s, largely. There was a lot of going back and forth, but largely it split in the 1700s, created a unate church similar to, in the case of the Church of the East, to the Chaldean Church, created a separate church. The Patriarch Mar Yonan resides in Beirut, Lebanon. There are members of the church in Lebanon, in Syria, and in particular in Iraq. There are also members in the United States, by the way, in Florida, something like 20 to 30,000 in one town in Florida. The largest town currently in the Nineveh Plain belongs to the Syriac Catholics now. No longer that status was held by the town of Tilkepe, which was the largest in the Nineveh Plain, had the most people. Most of its people have left and are living in the Michigan area now. Approximate number in Iraq, about 50,000. Again, the numbers are, you've got to kind of give and take a little bit here. Well, what about Assyrian organizations? Among the most powerful, and when I say powerful, I'm talking about organizations with budgets, with a program, with a bit of vision, and with some influence in the community. I would say the Assyrian Universal Alliance, or also known as the Assyrian Cultural Foundation, which sponsors these classes. This is not a plug, it's a fact. Which is in Illinois, the Assyrian National Council, which is in Illinois, which also teaches Assyrian classes and advocates for various programs throughout the world, in particularly in Iraq, supports the Assyrian Aid Society and so on. The Chaldean Community Foundation in Michigan, which has a very large center in Michigan and engages the community in many efforts and has very strong influence, along with the Chaldean American Chamber of Commerce in Michigan, among various politicians in Michigan, and is influencing even events in Iraq. The Assyrian Foundation of America is another organization in California. And of course, there are others. I'm not mentioning all Assyrian organizations. These are social or educational organizations or humanitarian organizations that exist to kind of create a magnetic force, as it were, of keeping the Assyrian population together. In Michigan, the Chaldean community, or the Assyrian Chaldean community, has succeeded in building up a great deal of wealth, but do not mistake this as an assurance that assimilation is no longer a factor. It certainly is a factor in Detroit, just as much as it is in every American city where Assyrians or Chaldeans reside. Families are very important in today's setting. They are the very foundation of our nation. They transmit primarily, the primary source of the transmission of language, the Assyrian language, culture, identity, and collective historical knowledge. No doubt you've heard the saying, it takes a village, and the family is a part of the village. And traditionally, Assyrian families have kept Assyrians together, maintaining their culture, their heritage, and intermarrying among each other. In other words, keeping the organism alive, the Assyrian organism. This is something that in the West is very grounds for major concern, I would say. In the West, the Assyrian birth rate is very low. And, speaking anecdotally, I would say where you have certain communities that are, for example, to take one example, Orthodox Jews in New York having children at a very high rate, or people in what we term the third world having children at a high rate, and compare them to Assyrians, it does not look good for the Assyrians in the diaspora. It does not look good. And when I say it does not look good, I'm speaking from a very historical perspective, meaning looking at history and knowing that the average Assyrian family had at least 5 or 6 or 7. They were reproducing, their numbers were growing, even during very difficult times. Looking at the current state of the nation now throughout the world, and particularly in the West, the situation does not look good. And what also does not look good is that no religious, meaning no church, no political party, no political program, no policies address the issue of low birth rates, or, for example, intermarriage. And this could be a controversial point, but I certainly am not trying to make it controversial. It's an observation. In the East, Assyrians or Christians cannot compete, for example, with Muslims or even Yazidis when it comes to the birth rate. Typically, what was said to us when we visited Iraq on multiple occasions was, for example, when you see an Assyrian village next to a Kurdish village, for example, in 10 years, you will see that Kurdish village double or triple, and Assyrians stay the same, or their numbers become less rather than more. So this is a very impactful observation that I'm making here. There are no economic, educational, political incentives to have large families among Assyrians, whereas the situation is not the same with others. And I don't want to go into too many examples, but there are other examples where there are incentives to having more children, for example. Certainly the destruction of agricultural lands, the displacement that has taken place, and the political and economic uncertainty in the Middle East has caused Assyrians, has taken its toll on Assyrians having less and less children. And I think out of all of the observations that I have made on the setting today of the Assyrian people, this is, I would say, by far one of the most impactful. If Assyrians are not, to put it very bluntly, if not primitively, reproducing at a sustainable rate, I think the Assyrian future is going to be in trouble. So the state of the nation, if we look at it throughout the world, has changed geographically, demographically. Communication is much better. Communication is much better because of the internet. People now have FaceTime, they have various ways of transmitting video. I'm only naming one, Instagram, and so on and so forth. There are so many social, Facebook and various social media accounts that allow people to communicate with each other. And this is communication with each other particularly in the Assyrian language, is a very important factor. So this is something that needs to be built up. The economy of the Assyrian nation, if we can call it that. Now, there are times when it intertwines, especially in family relations, or such as through, for example, chambers of commerce, the Assyrian American Chamber of Commerce, which is coming up in Illinois, the Chaldean Chamber of Commerce, and ones in California. But by and large, there is no centralized economy and no economic institutions that change things or that move change or influence change within the Assyrian community. Well, what about nationalism and identity? Now, from 1919 to 2019, that nationalism that was based on having some kind of geographic root, this magnet in Mesopotamia or Assyria, went from being the area that was claimed that you see in the kind of lighter pink to less light, which is darker, and to the darker. And now in the year 2019 or 2023, I would say there is no incentive at all to try to establish any type of an area, geographic area. Now, there are references, for example, to something called occupied Assyria among people. But I would say if we're being realistic and we're facing the current context within the Middle East today, this does not look like anything possible. I think if we are able to point to anything, there could be in Iraq in the future, perhaps a district, a small district that Assyrians could gather in and maintain their culture and heritage. But this, of course, will be really up to not just the Assyrians in the homeland, but Assyrians how and in what way Assyrians in the diaspora can support such an effort. But in terms of understanding this identity from the time of the Semele massacre and up until today, unfortunately, clashes have occurred within the larger Assyrian population, with some rejecting the term Assyrian. Here you see an image of Mar Afram Barsoum and a quote by him. Now, initially, as I've said before in various lectures in this class, Mar Afram Barsoum was supportive in 1919 of the idea of an Assyria. He pushed for it. He went to Paris for it. He was an advocate for it as a bishop. When he became patriarch, and in 1933, the Semele massacre occurred, and there were pressures from Turkey on him after 1919, he caved in, became very quiet, and rejected nationalism. And this, of course, triggered among many members in opposition, whereas before the term Assyrian was accepted within the Assyrian Orthodox Church, for example, in the United States. Here you see some memorabilia where the Assyrian Church was clearly used, or it was not opposed. At any rate, that turned out not to be the situation in the future. And especially in Europe and among certain segments of the Assyrian population, you have a new movement, relatively new, called Aramaean nationalism, this new terminology that is used for nation. This was not the case before. And among its leading members is Mr. Johnny Meso, who I certainly would love to have as a guest, and I'm going to try, and I would urge you to stay tuned for that, because we want to have a friendly and civilized and brotherly discussion. I'm looking forward to having that discussion with Mr. Meso, because we want to hear each other's views. But this is an indication of the state of things in terms of identity today. And of course, there's much more hostility from certain segments, unlike, for example, Mar Afram Barsoum, who simply rejected the Assyrian term. There's much more hostility on the fact of on the part of Mar Gregorios, for example, bishop in Turkey, who downright opposes and sees a major difference between the word Syriac and Assyrian, and considers it a distortion of historical fact and disrespect for truth and history in our community. And of course, historians do not feel the same way. One has to be aware of history, and this is a history class, and we must look to the accuracy of history. There is no such thing as an Aramaean identity that we can point to historically, archaeologically, demographically, and so on. This is a simply superimposed identity by the Assyrians, as we are told by Professor Dominic Bonat. The ruling classes in the so-called Aramaean kingdoms of Syria never refer to themselves as Aramaeans. As an ethnic term, Aramaean is a foreign construct. Let me repeat that. It's a foreign construct generated from Assyrian, biblical, and only a few local sources. So, for example, when our brothers speak of Aramaean identity, they often allude to the Old Testament and the Bible, and such information, of course, is reliable only as far as it is mentioned in the Bible, but certainly not rooted in history, in archaeology, in demography, and so on. And Professor Dominic Bonatz points that out brilliantly. And what does Assyriologist Frederick Mariofales says? He says, in sum, the people called Aramaeans, and he puts them in quote marks for a reason here. Remember what the previous scholar said, all but disappear after a long history going back to the Ahlamu. They are all Assyrians now, but Aramaean ethnicity survives in the form of a distinctive language with its attendant cultural contents. But remember, the cultural contents are something that people say. Here I criticize Assyriologist Mario Fallis, but you have to look at these cultural contents within the context of archaeology and geography. And certainly when Professor Bonatz talks about the Aramaean culture, he is talking archaeologically. Can you find Assyrian culture archaeologically? Absolutely. All throughout northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and southeastern Turkey. Can you find Aramaean culture archaeologically? Not so much. And the term Chaldean, of course, we don't need to repeat many times, though it is a term that brings our people together, a certain segment of our people together. The truth in history, and this is a history class, is that modern Chaldeans are descendants of Assyria, Assyrians from the heartland of Assyria, as stated by Seymour Parpola, an Assyriologist who has much to say about this subject. So, where have we been and where are we going? The kingdom of Ashur was built on the city of Ashur under the jurisdiction of the god Ashur. It was built largely as a business organization built on trade and commerce, not so much as a warrior kingdom. Ancient Assyria grew into a sophisticated state and then empire, and its foundation was subsequently the foundation of all empires that came. Assyrians survived the fall of their empire, and on one level were dispersed, but by and large they maintained their existence demographically and geographically in the Assyrian heartland. The adoption of Christianity was centered primarily on two institutions, the Church of the East and the Syriac Orthodox Church. This after a slow conversion to Christianity, by the way. It didn't happen overnight. These churches, of course, grew into the Syriac Catholic Church, as we said, and the Chaldean Church later. This grew from a national entity into an international one, particularly the Church of the East, which was the greatest missionary enterprise, then back into its national entity. So it went out throughout the Asian subcontinent, the entire Asian continent, all the way up until China. And of course, we cannot confuse people who became members of the Church of the East as Assyrians. They were converts into the One could call it the Assyrian Church or the Church of the East, whichever term. I'm comfortable with the Assyrian Church as well, because it came from Mesopotamia, or the Mesopotamian Church. They converted into the church, but they did not necessarily become Assyrians. Now, some may have, were kind of closer geographically, but by and large, others converted into the Church of the East, but there's a distinction between themselves and others who are members of the Church of the East, such as, for example, the Indian population on the subcontinent, which remain largely as members of the Syriac Orthodox Church, but also members of the Church of the East, and use the terminology, by the way, both Syriac and Chaldean, but they are members of the Assyrian Church of the East. We know that our people overcame genocide, repression, and dispersal all over the world. The Assyrians were living as a minority in their homeland and in the diaspora, attempting to now preserve their language, their heritage, and their collective past. And that's what we do in this class, is try to protect the collective past that we have, what ties us together as a people. The Assyrians are now struggling to build a coherent collective identity, and there's always discussions, as you've heard them mentioned. Are we Assyrian? Are we Chaldean? Are we Aramaean? Are we Syriac? What do these terms mean? I believe that if we learn to adapt to the changes taking place in the diaspora, if we begin to view these challenges that we face, among them the lowering birth rate that Assyrians have, the issue of assimilation that Assyrians are enduring, the dispersal, and so on, and learn to use technology to the best of our ability, and learn to use symbols, and learn to have organizations and families and individuals and churches work together in a coherent way towards building the dispersed, now dispersed people all over the world. This nation has a shot. Otherwise, sadly, it is doomed.